Incredible Hulk is not a deep character study of Bruce Banner. It isn't dripping with psychology or philosophy or subtext. It isn't an especially thought-provoking film. It isn't especially ambitious. It may sound like I'm criticizing, but these observations are precisely what make The Incredible Hulk work as a movie. It's primarily a big-action blockbuster that marries the traditional monster movie with the conspiracy thriller. The Hulk in this film is purely a scientific device, rather than a psychological one. There's certainly a lot of underlying humanity here, but it isn't about exploring an extraordinary man's unusual psyche using the Hulk as a personification of the part of the man he can't control, like it was in Ang Lee's Hulk movie. This is a simple film about an ordinary man, brilliant but otherwise ordinary, who can't get a break, and how he handles living in a world that is constantly, ruthlessly out to get him. Bruce Banner goes on a long physical journey in this movie that reflects an inner journey. It isn't about some deep metaphor about anger or complex family dynamics or mental illness. It's simply a story about one man's struggle to cope with things he can't control. It's a familiar story, but not an ineffective one. The biggest letdown about this movie for me is perhaps that it's not a real memorable film. There's not much here I haven't seen in the kinds of movies it borrows from. Again, monster movies and conspiracy thrillers. And while my personal preference would be a more damaged Bruce Banner, a guy with a really interesting and unusual psychosis, the guy whose mind mixed with gamma radiation created the Hulk because there was already something dark and dangerous under the surface, I still feel the need to call this a stronger effort than the 2003 Hulk film. By all accounts, there's a lot more interesting stuff happening thematically in that movie. It's a very haunting film visually, it's experimental, it's ambitious, but it's also so heavy. It's not really very much fun, and it's like work trying to keep up with it. By the third act, it's a convoluted and incomprehensible mess. It's pretty evident by director Louis Letterier's commentary that he was comparing his own work to Ang Lee's while he made this movie, and I'd imagine, though I don't know this, that Marvel Studios probably asked him to make something a lot more accessible and clean cut. Perhaps it's a safe action movie, but it's also very entertaining. The characters aren't emotionally detached. I care about what's happening to Banner, and it's a movie that expertly uses its visual medium to tell a lot of its story and to show us what its characters are going through without using a lot of extraneous dialogue. I wouldn't describe it as an incredible movie, but the Hulk himself is absolutely incredible to watch, and so it delivers what it's advertising. This is almost a silent film in its presentation. I don't mean that no one ever talks, but there's a lot less dialogue than modern audiences are used to, and it took me a couple of viewings to really get accustomed to it. It's very telling of how Hollywood has trained us to consume our entertainment. When we get a pretty simple and straightforward story like this, where a lot of scenes just show characters doing things rather than talking about them, and we feel uncomfortable because we're so used to a particular kind of pacing in American films. Never mind that it's perfectly clear what's happening on the screen, like when Banner accidentally drops some of his blood in a soda bottle and has to stop the whole bottling plant to make sure nothing gets contaminated. He doesn't explain why he's doing this to anyone. Almost no words are said beyond his yelling at the plant manager to shut everything down, and the story is going to tell us what all that was about, if we haven't guessed already, precisely when we need to know it. And yet, movies like this usually spoon-feed this kind of information to us right away because they're afraid we have such poor attention spans we'll get confused. In fact, in a movie I'm calling a somewhat typical action movie, the way it actually gives its audience a little bit of credit is pretty atypical indeed. This being the story of a fugitive with nowhere to turn, Banner is by himself a lot, and in the first third of the film, even when he does interact with anyone, nobody's speaking English. So Edward Norton has to act on his own a lot, and he absolutely nails every scene. Letterier says in his commentary that he was really impressed with Norton's ability to show so many different emotions and to keep up a constant level of intensity that keeps the audience engaged while just looking at a computer screen, especially given that all these text exchanges we're reading between he and a Mr. Blue are all added later in post. I completely agree. By the way, I think maybe now would be the perfect time to make a modern silent film, since so much interpersonal interaction these days takes place on computers and phones. You could convey a lot of exchanges without the need of a single intertitle. Part of the reason The Incredible Hulk is such an apt title is because it's filled with nods to the 70s live-action TV show of the same name. Lou Ferrigno, who of course played the Hulk in that show, has a delightful cameo as a security guard who takes a pizza bribe from Banner so he can try to find data about the Gamma accident on a university computer. He also played a security guard in the Ang Lee film too. Lou Ferrigno also voices the Hulk in the few places he speaks, and it only happens a few times, so it's never expected, and it's a treat every time. At the end, when Bruce is on the run again, fleeing as the Hulk after the fight in Harlem with the Abomination, Betty sends him her necklace in a package labeled David B., a reference to the fact that he was called David Banner in the TV show. And the best nod, I think, is the subtle use in only one scene that I noticed of the show's theme song of the score, The Lonely Man, probably one of the saddest pieces of piano music ever composed. But the film has a lot more in common with the show than homage. In some ways, it has a similar style of storytelling. The show was about a man on the run from the government, with a monster inside him he couldn't control, and the focus was on the emotional toll it took on him. It wasn't about a man who has a really bad temper and has a hard time controlling it, so it manifests itself as this horrible monster. It was about putting a man in extreme stressful situations that even the most patient of people would find difficult. That's exactly what we have here, with a lot more comic book sci-fi thrown in. It's like a $150 million episode of the TV show with a lot more elements lifted directly from the comics. As I said, this isn't a character study. We don't really get into Banner's head, but he certainly goes through a character arc, and I certainly care about what happens to him. He doesn't have to constantly analyze what the Hulk is in relation to himself, though we get some of that, and since the Hulk is a purely physical rather than psychological creation here, we don't need much. This story puts us right in the action and creates a constant sense of urgency. The Hulk is a time bomb, and from the start of the film, we're supposed to be on the edge of our seats waiting for it to go off. The movie plays with our expectations, waiting a full 20 minutes before finally letting the Hulk loose, even though this isn't an origin film and therefore could have easily opened with a scene of the Hulk rampaging. And only after everything in the world is thrown at Banner does the Hulk finally emerge. And even then, as Hulk starts tearing up a building as he's attacked by Ross's soldiers, we're only given glimpses of him in shadow until he finally shows his furious face to Ross. That's really effective in making the Hulk a scary monster. I'm not really scared of him as a viewer, of course, but this is a classic reveal of the movie monster that makes it more convincing that everybody in the film is scared of him. The film does a great job of keeping in mind viewers who aren't familiar with this material, and makes it the perfect introduction film for the Hulk, proving what I've always said about origins. We don't have to see Banner before he becomes the Hulk to appreciate him or to understand what's happening in the rest of the movie. And yes, I realize there are flashbacks in the opening credits to set the stage, but it isn't the whole movie like it was with Ang Lee's Hulk. To an extent, I think you have to try to watch this movie as if you don't know anything about the source material or other versions going in, because it seems designed with that in mind. When Betty finally screams "Dad" in the scene where Ross's team confronts Banner out in the open, that's actually a big reveal if you don't know these characters. The script is very careful to have Betty refer to him as the General up to this point, and it's natural because there's no reason she or Bruce would necessarily mention that he's her father to each other, because they already obviously know that. And she doesn't like him or really have much of a relationship with him, so it makes sense that she wouldn't call him Dad very often. There's not a lot of story going on in the opening scenes. They're about, again, seeing Banner cope. He has to learn Portuguese so he can get by, living as far away from home as he can so no one will find him. He works for day wages rather than going on payroll because he can't afford to give anyone his personal information. He's constantly monitoring his heart rate so he knows if he's getting close to an episode. He's learning techniques to have total control over his body in the hopes he can use those to keep the Hulk from coming out. It's these kind of little details that help us understand the kind of difficult life Bruce has to live. And as all of this is going on, we also see Bruce proactively trying to develop a cure for his condition. He easily could have just been a passive character who waits for things to happen to him and tries to suppress the Hulk. But this is a movie about control, and so we have a character who, despite all odds, tries his best to direct his own future. I think that's the thing that really makes him sympathetic. At one point, Bruce tells Betty that he doesn't want to control the Hulk, he wants to get rid of it. That's a really important exchange because it's what separates Bruce from everybody else with an interest in the Hulk. He made a mistake when he tested the serum on himself. He didn't know that Ross was trying to make a weapon, he thought he was just working on radiation immunity. But he was toying with things he didn't fully understand. He got lucky that, due to the primer Betty invented, his cells absorbed the gamma rather than killed him, and now he thinks he's learned his lesson. Well, maybe he got lucky. All things considered, maybe he would have been happier had it actually killed him. General Ross, Blonsky, and Sturms all have their own reasons for wanting to get their hands on the Hulk. They all want control of that power in some way or another. We'll get into that a little bit later. And that means getting control of Banner. General Ross has even stopped seeing Bruce as a person, really, saying that his entire body is property of the United States government. So it's a battle for control, and the only person who isn't interested in the same kind of control is Bruce. He doesn't want to use the Hulk for anything, doesn't see him as any kind of asset or weapon. All he wants is what everyone wants, control of his own life. The nice irony is that Banner and the Hulk want exactly the same thing, to be left alone. As soon as Banner transforms into the Hulk the first time, after knocking some of the soldiers around, we barely see him in shadows, and very subtly you can hear him say, "Leave me alone." It's cool that he says that so soon after transforming. Banner wants to get rid of the Hulk, but in a lot of ways, they're the same. And that's really what his arc is about. Understanding the Hulk and realizing that while definitely dangerous, he's not heartless. And this isn't a magical being that came out of nowhere. It was created in a lab, out of what was already there. It's not a part of his psyche manifesting itself, but he's still in there, however faintly, when the Hulk emerges. And so it turns out that the Hulk only attacks when he's attacked, never purposefully goes after innocents, and always protects the innocent whenever he can. We realize all of this through Betty's eyes, who stays with him in a cave after a fight with Ross's men, and he reacts with rage at the lightning. He seems like a pretty gentle creature at heart, but all he's ever known is violence. Whenever he thinks he's safe, something comes after him, just like Banner. The opening scene was cut from the film, and I really wish it hadn't been, because I think it's important to the place Bruce gets to by the end of the film. Bruce tries to commit suicide in the Arctic in that scene, and he can't because of the Hulk. This scene was actually made canonical, by the way, by Bruce mentioning it in The Avengers, when he says he tried to shoot himself, but, quote, the other guy spit it out. I understand Letterier's concern about it. He says in his commentary that he cut it because it was a really rough and depressing note to open a fun action movie with. On the other hand, I think it's an important story point. After Stearns tries out his antidote, which reverts the Hulk back to Banner, but there's no guarantee it's permanent, and Bruce is captured by General Ross, he chooses to jump out of the helicopter he's being held in to try to use the Hulk to stop the abomination. Now that he's starting to understand the Hulk's motivations and tendencies better, he says he can't control it, but maybe he can aim it. As Betty points out, he has no idea if he'll even change, but he says he has to try. Now up to this point, the Hulk has been nothing but a huge, dangerous burden, a bomb that might go off at any moment and cause damage that Bruce can't control but feels responsible for. Now he has a chance to use the Hulk to make a difference, and that's of course where the superhero part comes in. It's really important that a deliberate choice is made by Banner to use the Hulk to fight this huge threat that's going to hurt a lot of people. That makes Banner, and not just the Hulk, a superhero. So this is all great. Banner finally has a sense of purpose. If he dies, at least he died trying to do something noble and heroic, and plus he feels responsible because without the Hulk, there could be no abomination. But had the suicide attempt been left in, there would have been an extra layer on top of all this. Why would Bruce Banner want to kill himself? Because he hates running all the time? Because he personally doesn't want to get captured by the government and spend the rest of his life in a lab experiment? Maybe. We don't really know, especially since the scene's not even here, but Banner seems pretty selfless through the whole movie. When Stern says he wants to use Bruce's blood to do experiments in the hopes of making humans impervious to disease, Bruce says no. They have to destroy all of it. It's too dangerous. He's not concerned with himself. He was a scientist whose primary objective was to help other people, and when he realized he'd gone too far, he knew he was playing God, and he can't let anyone else do the same thing. I wonder if his attempted suicide then would have been, in his mind, a noble sacrifice. Since he hadn't been able to cure himself of the Hulk, he could cure the world of the Hulk by killing himself. And then, when he jumps out of the helicopter, that's his moment of change. To risk a sacrifice to try to use the Hulk, to use his failure to stop the abomination, to do something good with it. It's still an arc that works well, but the suicide attempt would have added a lot to it. All four characters with a vested interest seem to represent a different kind of control, like I mentioned earlier, and this theme is really what blends these two big action genres. In monster movies and in conspiracy movies, there's often a government trying to get their hands on something huge and dangerous they don't understand, or else trying to do something to get way more power than the film is preaching they deserve or can handle. For example, in the original Godzilla film, you have a government experimenting with nuclear weapons, and because they're dealing with these huge destructive forces, they pay for it by creating a terrible monster that terrorizes their innocent citizens that they have to then try to take down. Similar thing here. So you got Bruce Banner, whom we've talked about quite a bit already. He's partially responsible for unleashing this unnatural force, but in his case, it was legitimately an accident. His intentions were noble. It was the government that was trying to create living weapons, and so the film blames them and shows Banner more in the light of a victim, though one with a conscience. He represents self-control. How appropriate, right? What I mean by that is, When it comes to the Hulk, he doesn't have some big plan, isn't interested in using the Hulk for his own gain. He simply wants to be able to control himself, both to prevent other people from controlling him and to stop himself from turning into the Hulk. His character arc changes his point of view some, but at the end of the film, when he's learned how to turn the Hulk on, he still has the same interests. He's a person with just intentions. He can't help but stop trouble when he can, as we see when he comes to a female co-worker's aid at the beginning of the film who's being harassed by some punks. He's going to use the Hulk now to do what he would have done anyway. He simply learned again how to aim it. Then there's General Ross, who represents governmental control. Because the film blames him for creating the Hulk and because he's still trying to get his hands on Banner, not to protect the people, but to make weapons with Banner's blood, he's completely vilified. He's a pretty archetypical military man, bent on arming the military as much as possible to a point of obsession, pretty much just because that's his job. Though none of the other characters are especially developed, Ross is the one whose motivations I don't understand. He puts this super soldier program above his daughter, who's completely alienated him, and fully believes that no man's life is more important than making the military as powerful as it can possibly be, including genetically engineering invincible soldiers. He wants the government to have total control so no one else does, as you'd probably expect. But I think even an archetype needs a more personal reason to do something so extreme. I keep wanting to assume there's something in this guy's past that's made this such a huge priority, but we're never told what that is, which makes the film border on being simply anti-military rather than this element being a natural part of the story. Then there's Blonsky, another military man, but he's not looking for the government to have total control of the Hulk's power, he just wants it for himself. He represents the age-old quest for the fountain of youth, the control of personal life and death. He wants immortality and godhood, and another really extreme character who's willing to do crazy things to get what he wants, mostly just because the movie really needs someone over the top enough to become the Abomination. That's pretty much what he was in the comics, of course, and at least I get his motivations more than I get Thunderbolt Ross's. But once again, I could have used a little more background about him to make it more believable that he's so obsessed with violence. And he's totally okay with possibly turning into something grotesque just to get in a big giant grudge match with the Hulk. As far as I can tell, just because nobody else can do it and he wants to be the one that can. By the way, some fans complain about Stern's line that he might turn into an abomination, but that's alright with me. It's a nod to the fans rather than an obvious naming of the character since nobody else calls him that later. And then lastly, we have Stearns, who in the comics gets a super brain and becomes the leader. He's perfectly set up for that here. He already has the personality for it, saying, "I've always been more curious than cautious, and that served me pretty well so far." And then we find just how insanely curious he is and how whacked out his priorities are. He seems to just want to help Banner at first, as we find that he is the Mr. Blue he's been talking with, the guy we assumed would be the big confidant and sidekick, and then quickly we find he just wants to study Banner's blood. If he can stop the transformation of the Hulk, that means he can control the blood, which he can then use to make humans impervious to disease and win world fame and fortune. He represents scientific control, becoming a god on a much larger scale than Blonsky wants. Blonsky just wants to be a physical god, but Stearns wants to be God, to create and destroy at will. They're similar in that both are motivated by the desire to do whatever has never been done before, and what separates them is simply their personal interests. One's a soldier and one's a scientist. Stearns is my favorite part of the movie, as it's not only a really clever way to introduce a threat for a possible later movie and cool fan service for diehards, but he is also the perfect example of how the universe always seems to be against Banner. Finally, he gets to the scientist who can possibly cure his condition, and the guy turns out to be one more psycho who wants to exploit him for his own gain. The reveal of Stearns' real motivations is the one really unpredictable bit in the movie, and when Banner's blood drips onto his head and his mouth curls into that twisted smile, I couldn't help but grin myself. I've been focusing hard on the theme of the film, and I don't want to contradict myself. Though I'm really analyzing this, it's very much in the background, and the main thrust of the movie really is the action and the ambiance. Letterier seems very proud of himself for doing a lot of exotic, on-location shooting and using visual effects as sparingly as possible, which I think is really commendable, considering he's got two giant monsters that are 100% digitally rendered. There's a lot of beautiful photography in the film, and a wonderfully stark contrast between New York City and the other parts of the world Banner finds himself himself in. The soundtrack is also really expressive and emotional, and it complements Norton's performance perfectly. For being pretty sad overall, there's a lot of well-integrated comedy that lightens the mood and reminds us that this is an expansive comic book universe, and it never borders on silly or out of control. My favorite example is when Bruce tries to say, "You wouldn't like me when I'm angry," in Portuguese, but he accidentally says, "You wouldn't like me when I'm hungry," and the punks are really confused. We've got a Hulk with a personality. I love how he uses smashed cars and other vehicles as weapons. When he finally says Hulk smash, it really feels like a cheer out loud kind of moment. And I love it when he thinks he's finished off Abomination, but he gets up and Hulk just sighs and rolls his eyes, tired and bored with this, and then immediately gets angry. The performance I was most surprised by the first time I saw this was Liv Tyler's, as she's an actress I don't generally care for. But here I thought she was the perfect Betty Ross. She turned in a really sincere performance, and I've never believed two people on screen were in love and had known each other a long time like I did these two. Again, it all came from facial expressions and body language rather than a lot of dialogue. These two just feel like they've worked together and they've been together a lot. I also really appreciate that there wasn't a big love triangle plot between Bruce, Betty, and the generic therapist boyfriend she's dating. Sure, the therapist calls Thunderbolt Ross on Banner, but it's not because he's jealous. It's because he doesn't have all the facts and he thinks he's doing the right thing. When Betty and Bruce start to get intimate, there's not any talk at all about her current boyfriend. And I'm okay with that because they both know this isn't going to last. This is likely to be the last time they'll ever see each other, and if it weren't for the Hulk, they'd be together now, and there wouldn't be this generic therapist boyfriend. Since the deep psychology isn't played up with the Hulk, it makes sense that the change is based on heart rate and not on specifically getting angry, but I do think that's making things way worse for Bruce than maybe they should be. The whole universe is against this guy. Nothing ever goes his way, and he's still doing his best to do the right thing. Can he at least get intimate with the girl he's never going to see again? After this scene, it's a wonder he doesn't try to commit suicide again. There are some story points that are too convenient for me. The movie does a nice job of establishing a status quo and breaking it, but it's more effective to have a single event that begins a chain of reactions as opposed to two things that happen that occur at the same time. That's too coincidental for me. Bruce's blood is found in a bottle of soda Stan Lee drinks, which is probably my favorite of his cameos because it makes him an integral plot point, and that gets General Ross on his trail. But at the same time, Banner is really close to getting a cure with his research with Stearns. It seems unlikely that after 5 years of making no mistakes and the military never finding him, the precise moment Banner is about to find a cure to the thing Ross is after is when they finally track him down. I'm going to give Incredible Hulk a 3 out of 4. Solid story, solid acting, riveting fights, and just enough human stuff going on that I had something to talk about.
Bye.